enigma I will not explain. Its dark saying must be left unguessed. The year is 1899. In a small town close to the Welsh border, surrounded by dark, brooding hills, a 42-year-old man puts the final touches to a work which was to mark his transition from the status of a minor local composer to perhaps England's greatest. The town was Malvern, the work, the Enigma Variations. The composer, of course, Edward Elgar. The words you heard at the beginning of this program were Elgar's own, taken from his program notes for the first performance of his Variations on an Original Theme. The composer's words were prophetic. No one will ever unravel with any certainty the enigma contained in the work. During the next hour, though, we shall be trying to shed some more light on the matter in the company of Elgar's godson, Woolston Atkins, the eminent musicologist Dr. Percy Young, and Professor Ian Parrott, the composer and musical scholar. First, Elgar the man, remembered by his godson.
I was less than 4 when I first really got to know him well, and from 1923 onwards, of course, I had the privilege of spending nearly every Sunday supper with him.
They must have been marvellous occasions.
He was, they were.
I mean, could you sum up in words what that man was?
This is, of course, extremely difficult to do. He was very much a multi-character man. Quite honestly, I very much doubt if I, even though I think I knew him as well as most people, knew more than about 3 facets of that great personality. The one thing I can say, which struck everyone, of course, is his personality. You couldn't enter, or rather he couldn't enter a room without everybody in that room knowing that he had entered it. He was the most lovable person to be with when you really got to know him. He was so kind. He loved children. He loved dogs. He loved horses. He lived life to the full. Frankly, if he had not composed a single thing, I think he would have been just as great a man. His knowledge of literature was profound. Very few people realize that he was quite a brilliant, for his day, chemist.
No, I didn't know that.
I'm sure you didn't. And in fact, he actually invented a machine for making sulfurated hydrogen, which was in use in schools, and particularly in Herefordshire schools, right up to the beginning of the First World War.
So, could he shed any light on the enigma?
No, I can't. I can only say this to you. I am by no means convinced, in fact, that it is a musical phrase at all. I think it was an idea. I don't say I've got the right idea, but the sort of idea is that I think it probably was friendship.
Now Professor Ian Parrott, formerly of Aberystwyth University, and the author of a number of books on Elgar. He was closely associated with the composer's family.
And his daughter did help me a great deal when I was writing my book, and she was quite sympathetic about this, about the Enigma Variations, and the main solution to the enigma. Hearing St. Paul when he went to church, and he heard the words in the Quinquagesima epistle. That's what Elgar heard, and they end in Latin with the Greek word enigmate. You see, now we see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see more clearly. Or now we find only puzzling reflections as in a mirror, but the time will come when we shall see everything clearly. Now that's what happened. He was first of all a provincial nobody, and he became, with that work, a world-famous composer. Now, he was a modest man. He couldn't shout about it, so he just wrote the one word Enigma on the score. Now, the daughter confirmed to me that he did go to church on Quinquagesima Sunday, 1899.
Let's now listen to some of the music played in this historic 30-year-old recording by Sir Adrian Boult with the London Philharmonic Orchestra. And Dr. Percy Young, the eminent musicologist, describes some of Elgar's friends portrayed within.
All we know about Richard Baxter Townsend in his variation is that he was supposed to be a humorous old gentleman. Well, in fact, he was a distinguished classical scholar who translated Tacitus. He wrote a number of novels and historical works, and he went as a young man to Texas and Arizona prospecting, and he in fact writes a marvelous passage in, I think the book is called Confessions of a Tenderfoot, but won't be absolutely certain of that, about his meeting with Billy the Kid. He came back to England after many adventures and went back to teaching at school in Bath. The great squire-archic figure, we do sort of build up images of people which are generally totally false. No ancient line. His grandfather had made a fortune in pottery, in the potteries, and like everybody who made fortunes in places which are dirty, moved out to somewhere that was clean. Hence the bakers. Richard Arnold, who was the dissolute son of the poet Matthew Arnold, who in fact ran up so many debts at Oxford that his father had to go to America and give lectures to earn enough to pay his son's debts. Well, I suppose one of the great excitements of my life was 1932 at Three-Class Festival, sitting in Worcester Cathedral. A lady here and a gentleman either here or on that side, and at a prominent moment he came to me and said, "You know who you're sitting by?" He said, "That's Isabel, Enigma Variations." I remember her very clearly, and because we had not a quite perfunctory conversation, but not a particularly important conversation, but I always remember how charming she was.
A Welsh connection now, described by Professor Ian Parrott.
Troit. He was a Welshman, or son of a man from Carmarthen, Troit Griffith, an architect. Yes, and he was probably unmusical, and that's why we heard this story that he could solve the enigma if he could work out the pieces of paper which were stuck on the notes of the piano. The problem was that he didn't seem to know one note from another.
I didn't realize there was a Welsh connection with Troit.
Yes, there is, and it goes further if you're interested. I mean, there's Elgar said that their ancestors worked together to sack Hereford. I think they got the year wrong. They said about 800 AD or something. It may have been then, but I think Percy Young went into this, and it's a bit later. But there was what was his name? Griffith up something. Griffith. Oh, I've forgotten his full name. Anyway, he was a great prince. And Elgar's ancestor was Elgar, the renegade Saxon, who helped the Welsh prince.
Station 11 bears the initials GRS. Professor Parrott.
If you listen to the music, and I beg of you, do that sometime, listen to the music and it sounds like an organist, especially with his feet. See, that stuff right down in the bass. Boom, 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 boom. Sounds like Bach, and Sinclair is an enthusiast for Bach. See, I know all these bits and pieces, you see. And they both love Bach, and of course Elgar presented all the collected works of Bach to Birmingham University when he was appointed professor there for a short time in 1905. Now, I'm a firm believer that when Elgar wrote that, originally, when he thought of it in 1898, or certainly when he orchestrated it in 1899, he was thinking of an organist. There's no doubt whatever. I mean, Mr. Wollstonecraft doesn't agree with me on this, but he's very proud of Elgar's orchestration, and so am I, and it sounds like an organist. The point I'm making is that it doesn't sound like a bulldog. So you see, now you say to me, well, why does everyone think it is a bulldog? And the answer to that is that Elgar himself, at a later stage, but quite a lot later, said so. Now that's the point. Now you see, Elgar's pulling people's legs. Mr. Wollstonecraft just now said he thought he was having his leg pulled on one occasion. He admitted that. So why didn't he admit it with this famous occasion? When
but I believe the grave of the bulldog is there in Hereford.
Well, the bulldog's all right. I mean, I'm not throwing the bulldog out completely. Indeed, I think he should be allowed in with his master. Maybe the final answer to that is a compromise. But it is basically G.R. Sinclair, the organist, sounds like an organist, who is brilliant on his feet. And I personally have this rather unique experience of being a pupil of a man called Broadhurst, who was Sinclair's assistant. Now, I never heard Broadhurst ever play a wrong pedal note, and he said that his teacher never played a wrong pedal note. Now, that's a peddler, you see, not a bulldog as a paddler, although that's what everyone thinks. That's my special view. So I leave it with you to think about.
Professor Ian Parrott. Now, Dr. Young's view.
An open question. It could have been either, but I have myself been doubtful about the bulldog. Because I haven't the dates by me, but I did study the Herefordshire newspapers. I think it was the time of Sinclair's demise, that there was a long article on his love of bulldogs, and he had several of the same name, which Dan. And when he was writing the variations, the bulldog was, in my view, too young to have plunged into the river and got out safely. The date of that particular bulldog is recorded on a little bulldog gravestone in the garden of the now Conservative Club in Hereford, which was the organist's house. I simply thought the dates didn't tie up. But Sinclair could very well have had previous bulldogs. He certainly had subsequent ones. Didn't work at any time in his life and drank himself to death and died of cirrhosis of the liver.
Variation 13 is identified only by 3 asterisks and has been the cause of some controversy in the last 12 months. Let our 3 contributors put forward their own ideas. First of all, Winston Atkins.
Well, I think I mentioned earlier, of course, that I myself used to go, I had an open invitation to go on any Sunday I possibly could, and towards the end of his life, it was very noticeable that Elgar was beginning to talk about his own earlier days. In particular, his very happy days with a Dr. Buck, who lived in Settle, and staying with him and all the rest of it. Well, now, I wasn't present when he actually told my father. In fact, I suspect, though I don't even know this for sure, I suspect it was within the last 10 days or so of his life that he told my father that he had been engaged before, and he had been engaged to this Helen Jessie Weaver. Well, now, I knew something about the Weaver family because they had owned the best-known shoe and boot shop in the county. All the hunting people and shooting people and everybody else used them. So I knew the name. But, of course, I really knew no more. And it was, in fact, nearly 2 years after this, when my father and I were on holiday in September of 1935, after the Worcester Festival, in which the Elgar Memorial window had been opened. And we were talking about this, and then my father said, "There's something which has been troubling me a bit, and I want to talk to you about." And he then told me how Elgar had told him about Helen. And he said, "I am in a difficulty over this. Elgar never said that it was confidential, but on the other hand, in 50 years he had never disclosed the fact. I also made discreet inquiries, which leads me to believe that Carrie, his daughter, knows nothing at all about this.
Really?
I feel, therefore, that it would be wrong to do anything about it now. But on the other hand, I am absolutely convinced that this emotional experience must have affected some of Elgar's works, and it wouldn't therefore be right to conceal this. I have made up my mind that in order to avoid any possibility of hurting anyone's feelings, that it should not be disclosed until 50 years after Elgar's death. Now, I want you to promise me that you will ensure that that takes place." So I said, "Well, of course, I will do whatever you wish in the matter." And we decided the best way to do it, in fact, was to write a letter which would, at the appropriate date, because I might have been dead, and certainly my father would have been dead, would in fact be sent to the birthplace trustees. Little did I know at that time that I, in fact, was in time to become chairman of the trustees. Well, this letter, in fact, which was written specially, was never delivered, because it occurred to me that as my own book would not be published until shortly after, 50 years after Elgar's death, that my own book appeared to be by far the best way of ensuring that this piece of information became known.
And of course, you also say that the violin concerto was dedicated to this same person.
I didn't say that positively. What I said was that there had always been a great mystery about the Variation 13, of course, and in particular about the violin concerto. The problem of the violin concerto is a very obvious one. We knew many people who were associated with them, but all of them, in fact I did too, but all of them were alive when it was written. Well, Elgar, in fact, took a Spanish phrase, which, if it is interpreted into English, says, herein is enshrined the soul of. This always worried my father, because that is not a phrase that you would normally use for a living person. My father was therefore convinced that whoever it was dedicated to must have been dead at that time. But he had no idea who it was. We still don't know for certain, but on having learnt of Helen, it would appear an obvious person it might have been.
Talking once more about that 13th variation, it fits in so nicely with a quotation from Calm Sea Prosperous Voyage, which appears in that as well, wouldn't it? I mean, it all comes together.
Well, this quotation, of course, is in fact the difficulty, because LML, which were the initials of Lady Mary Ligon, appeared on Elgar's original manuscripts. But when he sent it to the printers, he substituted 3 stars. Now, it had always been said that the reason for that was that Lady Mary was on ship and he couldn't get her consent. But the difficulty to that is that, unfortunately, that is quite untrue. In fact, Lady Mary did not go away until April the 11th. The Enigma variations were finished in February, and rather curiously, Alice Elgar's diary shows that Lady Mary was actually having tea with them on the occasion that Elgar sent the full score to Vert, who was Richter's agent. Well, now, therefore, whatever the reason is, it cannot have been that she was not available to be asked.
Of course.
The other reason, of course, and here is that many people, my father in particular, but Ernest Newman and other people, have always felt that the emotions are so strong in variation number 13 that it must have been some very, very special emotional occasion that was responsible for that variation. And though I happen to know Lady Mary when she was a very old lady, she was a very charming, delightful lady. Elgar owed a great deal to her because she had really started the competitive music festival. But none of us could quite see how this charming lady could possibly, with her friendship, have generated these feelings.
Elgar's godson, Worston Atkins. Now, Dr. Percy Young.
Because the matter of the 13th variation has suddenly erupted from 2 sources, and we have a contradiction between Mr. Worston Atkins, who bases what must be a theory on his memory of what his father said many years ago, and on the other hand we have the grandson of Lady Mary Ligon, who is suggesting that the variation was dedicated, if I use the word dedicated, to her. I find that his statement is a little embarrassed by the fact that he doesn't appear to know when Lady Mary Ligon was doing what at what time. The first point to remember is that Lady Mary Ligon was a great musical influence in Worcestershire. She lived with her brother Beecham at Madresfield Court. She established the Madresfield Music Festival, which was an important occasion in the life of musical Worcestershire. We moved to the year 1899, the crucial year when the Enigma variations were composed between about January of that year, although the sketches had been around sometime before that, I imagine, and about February, when a score was sent to the agent of Hans Richter, who ultimately accepted the work for performance in June. Throughout the year, almost at the last moment, Elgar was working on the orchestral score. Between the 8th and 10th of May in 1899, the Madresfield Musical Festival took place. Elgar was present on the 8th. He had previously assisted Lady Mary Ligon at rehearsals. During the early part of the spring, Lady Mary Ligon, I quote from Lady Elgar's diary, Lady Mary Ligon came to tea with the Elgars, accompanied by Richard Arnold, who was another of the variations. There was a close understanding between Elgar and her ladyship. She, in that year, was destined to go to New South Wales to act as hostess for her brother, who was becoming Governor General of New South Wales. The day she left, the dates are important. The day she left was May the 11th. A train left Foregate Street, Worcester, at about 2 in the afternoon. And as was the practice in those days, a company of well-wishers went down to the station to bid her goodbye. Lady Elgar's diary. E, that is Edward, her husband, presented Lady L with a bouquet. I think that is a nice point, that you don't just go presenting bouquets to any lady, but only those for whom you have a particular regard. Let me say that Elgar was in a sense distant from her by circumstances of birth, but he had a respect for that family and for that particular person. Now, on May the 2nd, he wrote to his friend Jaeger, Vello. Now, variation 13. I have altered the phrase, and he shows what he wanted to alter the phrase to. The pretty lady is on the sea and far away, and I meant this as a little quotation from Mendelssohn's Mehr Stille und glückliche Fahrt. I did not acknowledge it as the critics, if one mentions anything that kind, talk of nothing else. Now, there is absolutely no doubt at all that that variation was intended to relate to Lady Mary Ligon, who in the letter to Jaeger is described as being on the sea and far away. Hence, we have abundant proof that no other female person was involved in that variation.
What credibility, if any, then, do you give to this mysterious Helen?
None at all. I mean, she existed.
Well, she existed,
yes,
undoubtedly.
There are several references in letters to Dr. C.W. Buck, who was a Yorkshire friend of Elgar's. Oh yes, she was there, but she disappeared to New Zealand. That was the end of her.
Not even with the violin concerto, which they also think could have been dedicated to her.
I have seen no evidence to suggest that that could possibly be the case. I have a feeling that it was supposition rather than hard documented fact.
Dr. Percy Young had a very different theory. And now, an interesting idea from Professor Ian Parrott.
Well, that could have been Rosa Burley. You see, she was the headmistress of the school where Elgar's daughter went, As a matter of fact, in 1901, they went to Llangrannog, not very far away from where I still live, by the way. And they went there in August 1901. And Rosa Burley could have been walking on the seashore with Elgar, and they could have heard the sound of singing, and this could be the beginnings of this great theme which went into the introduction of the Allegro.
That's right.
There are problems there because Rosa Burley was a bit unreliable. I think she would have liked to have been in the Enigma variation. There's not a great deal more evidence that she could be that variation. But what interests me more in a way is the fact that Elgar was obviously quite a friend in those early days, and they did go to Llangrannog. They had a wonderful time, and they had to go by train so far, and then on a cattle truck for the last bit, and they were never quite sure what they heard, but I think he heard Hyn Rad Van Hadai, you see, the second half. Dee-da-da-dum, da-dee-da-da-dum. That with the interludes, dee-da-da-dum, pom-pom, dee-dee-da-da-dum, pom-pom. It fits beautifully with a little extra, you see, and he heard it coming wafting over the air from the seashore. Possibly he was up in the cliffs, possibly he was down on the sands. We're never quite sure on that one either.
I read that Mr. Atkins also confirmed that he thinks that the violin concerto could have been to her as well.
Right, so yes. Of course, the view recently, and people like Michael Kennedy and others have rather tended to push this one, I think, is that it was Lady Mary Stuart of Wortley. Incidentally, she is an aunt of Lady Mary Mansell Lewis of Llanelli. And I did come over here not so long ago talking about Elgar, and she very kindly gave me some introductions to try and work that one out. But we didn't get any more news, I'm afraid. But that is the Millay family. She was called Stuart Wortley, and then she became Lady Alice Stuart of Wortley. And she was, of course, very fond of Elgar, and there's a great deal of correspondence there which hasn't been gone through carefully. I think that's possibly the soul of the violin concerto. So I'm not terribly keen on this Helen Weaver, as you've noticed. But I do like one thing about the 13th variation, and that is, I think that there are 3 stars, we don't know quite why. The violin concerto, by the way, has 5 stars.
That's right.
But this variation has 3, but it does say under...
That would be the initial, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, it might be, but it does say, it also says under it, romancer. Strange word, romancer. Why? I mean, that doesn't apply to Lady Mary Ligon, you see. I mean, they would be too respectable to have a romance, such a thing. But it could, might be his funny way of covering up his early memories.
fittingly enough with Sir Edward Elgar's own self-portrait.